Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And I'm delighted to welcome a regular and much esteemed speaker on Blogging Theology, Dr. Louay Fatoohi. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Paul. As ever, I'm really honored to be on your channel.
The honor is all ours, sir. The honor is all mine, sir, to have you on.
Well, and speak to your audience. And thank you very much, and also for your interest in my book.
Yes, we'll come to that. But before we mention that, just for a few people who may not know who you are, you're originally from Baghdad in Iraq, and you converted to or reverted from Christianity to Islam in your early 20s. You have a PhD from Durham University here in the UK, published extensively on Islamic studies, and is particularly interested in comparative accounts that we find in the Quran with their counterparts in the Bible and so on and other sources. And you're interested in comparative Abrahamic religions in general, tafsir as well, the historical Jesus, and Sufism, which is our focus today. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Blogging Theology Academy. Now, you've just published a book. This is the one here, Tawhid, according to Sufis, the oneness of God in Sufism. Very interesting. So I'm just going to read from the back cover to give people a bit of context before we chat about the book and Sufism and its criticisms of Sufism and misunderstandings and so on. So you say on the back cover, Sufism, often described as the spiritual dimension of Islam, is a way of life centered on cultivating noble character and attaining states that draw the servant closer to his or her Lord. As the foundation of Islam, Tawhid, as the oneness of God, occupies a central position in Sufi thought and practice. Sufis have engaged in extensive discourse on Tawhid, guided by the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. However, certain Sufis have faced criticism, with their understanding of Tawhid questioned, and even accusations of disbelief leveled against them. This has often arisen from misunderstandings surrounding the Sufi concept of fana, which is spiritual annihilation, the misinterpretation of their metaphorical language, and the decontextualization of their statements from their broader teachings and lives. This book presents a selection of sayings that illuminate various aspects of Tawhid, Sufism, and they demonstrate that Sufis perceive human cognition as inherently limited in comprehending the divine being, and stress that true glorification of Allah requires acknowledging this limitation and accepting divine self-disclosure without excessive rationalization. So that is what the back cover of the book says. So I've got to ask you, perhaps why you thought you had to write this book, and also how you first got interested in Sufism as a convert to Islam. Why Sufism? But perhaps you can first tell us a bit more about the genesis of the book itself.
Okay, so as you would expect, Paul, at any point in time, I have a number of projects, work on a number of projects, a combination of books, papers, videos really when I have the time. But usually I have running projects. Some of them take long, maybe years, etc. But they're on the to-do list. And these would be topics I'm personally interested in. I don't write professionally. I don't write because I have to write these topics. I'm not under obligation by any institution, etc., to choose certain topics to write about. I write what I consider to be, what I find interesting to me, challenges in particular. I enjoy tackling difficult ones. And that's what got me really into looking at historical miracles in the Quran and the amount of criticism the Quran received as a result of that. We've dealt in previous videos with some of these topics.
Yeah.
So, but this book, obviously I'm interested in Sufism. I've written quite a lot about Sufism, books, articles. I've done videos. I've got an Arabic channel actually where I do videos on Sufism. But that was never ever a topic I had thought of writing. The concept of Tawhid obviously is foundational in Islam, but it wasn't really something I would thought of. But the end of 2021, in December, specifically 2021, I saw a phrase in my dream in Arabic, Tawhid and the Sufiya, which means Tawhid according to Sufis. I felt like I woke up immediately after I saw that. There wasn't really much other than that. But I understood there and then that this is a book. The book had not been written. And the book would consist of sayings of Sufis that expressed different aspects of Tawhid, articulate Tawhid in many different ways. When I kind of thought about it, I'm still in bed now, and I thought, well, what is that? That was going to be like a listing of sayings, one like another. It's all about this one concept. That's going to be pretty boring, really. I don't think I'm going to make much of it. But then immediately my thinking changed, and I said, no, actually, there must be a way of making this an interesting book, even if it contained or consisted mainly of sayings about this specific subject of Tawhid. And I thought, and I actually, this is something I mentioned in the book idea section at the beginning of the book. I didn't mention there is that I actually went back to sleep. I slept again, and I saw another phrase, supposedly also a book, article, whatever, again to do with Sufis, but I still can't make sense of it, as in how to turn it into something that I think substantive enough to write a book about it. So that stays aside. Whether it will become something one day or not, I don't know. In the morning, when I later in the day, I actually did a quick search on Google to try and see whether, because it sounded like something a lot of people would have written about Tawhid and Sufism. How come? And I actually did search, and I couldn't find any book on the subject, which I find quite kind of counterintuitive in some way. And then because it wasn't really kind of an urgent project of mine, I kind of let it on a slow burner, if you like. I would just go back, do a little bit on it every now and then focus on my main interests. So this is why it took really 3.5 years, even though it's a small book, which could have been done much faster, because exactly, it's like 160, 165 pages. And then in the course of compiling those quotes and commenting on them, I realized what was happening is that I had to tackle certain themes regularly every time I deal with particular quotes. So I decided then, why don't I add at the beginning of the book an introduction to Sufism, so I can kind of pave for the subject matter and not need to tackle these issues every now and then. And then another book on Tawhid, oneness of God in Islam, in Islam in general and in Sufism. And that's really mainly the structure of the book. Obviously, at the beginning, I also give an introduction about the sources I used and why I chose those specific sources. And I went mainly with the earliest sources we have on Sufism and books written by Sufis. So that's really, in a nutshell, where this book came about.
You dedicate a chapter to each prominent Sufi throughout history. Obviously people like Ibn Arabi and Al-Ghazali and Jilani, many famous thinkers who were Sufi. But how did you first get interested in Sufism yourself?
Yeah. Okay. So I had a friend, a very close friend, through whom I really learned about Islam. And that was second year at university back in Iraq. So we are talking 1980, a long time ago. And at the time, actually, I had become an atheist, having moved from Christianity originally. And at some point, I was actually a good Christian, practicing Christian. But I ended up losing all faith in the existence of God, a religion in general. So through this friend at university, I became interested in Islam. And we spent a lot of time together. We were very close to each other. And so that's how I got gradually interested in Islam, reading about it, etc. And when I speak about Islam for me, the reversion to Islam wasn't like it happened maybe to most people or to a lot of people. It was more of a process that took time. So there wasn't like one particular point when I became a Muslim, let's say. It was a gradual development of thinking. I was particularly interested in kind of looking at the New Testament, for instance, the Gospels. I wrote a critique of it, as you know, at the time. I looked at the Quran, and one thing that attracted me from the very beginning is the differences between the Quran and the New Testament and the Bible in general, stories that, for instance, you find in both scriptures. And this particular topic became really ultimately later my main line of research and interest in intellectually in Islam. And then I think Sufism, it was part of what my friend and I used to read about, talk about. Sufism in Iraq is popular. So there are lots of like people who are kind of have this interest in Sufism. I remember reading about Sufis like Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, Ahmed al-Rifa'i, Ibrahim al-Dasuqi, certain not Ibn Arabi, not that kind of philosophical, if you like, no. The more kind of, probably a lot of people would call them Sunni Sufis, let's say, but that kind of standard, if you like, Sufism that hasn't attracted a lot of controversy. And I was interested in the paranormal. And indeed, I wrote early on quite a few books on that subject. And I was interested on the concept of karama, or a supernatural feat or miracle in Sufism. That was part of what attracted me. And then one day we visited, my friend and I, the shrine of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani in Baghdad. It's very famous, which is also used to be his school at the time. And that was, I think, on a Thursday or something. And then on Saturday, somebody came to my friend. We work in the same factory, if you like, but different kind of places. And then I had just, graduated with a physics degree at the time. So I was working as a physicist in a mechanical factory. Same, my friend. So somebody came to him just out of the blue, and he said, oh, there is a taqiyya like a Sufi center in Baghdad, very famous, very big one. And it belongs to the tariqah of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. Why don't you come and visit? Completely out of the blue, unconnected to our visit a day or two earlier. Don't remember the exact timing. So we went there. And it was actually, we kind of became Sufis in the sense we kind of took what they call bay'ah, or pledge, by hand, just out of curiosity, really. I didn't know much at the time. And that was who was going to become my sheikh, with whom I was, became close for a long time, for decades. And that was really my introduction, but really originally didn't know much, curiosity, but I loved some ideas, and I loved the life of piety. When you read about those Sufis, you couldn't stop being impressed by how they lived, what they spoke about. And that was really what got me into Sufism originally.
Okay. Now, Tawhid is obviously the central concept in the book, but can you perhaps briefly outline for us what Tawhid actually is before we discuss further subjects to do with the etymology of the word Sufism or word Sufi, its meaning and so on. But what is Tawhid?
So Tawhid in Arabic really kind of comes into slightly different but related meanings. Tawhid as a noun means the concept of God being one. Right. And Tawhid also, you can think of it as a verbal noun. So the if you like, being muwahhid, or believing in the oneness of God, that act is an act of Tawhid, both of them. So you can think of it as the concept, noun, Tawhid. So Tawhid at its most basic meaning, it means the belief that there is only one God, one creator, and we are, everything else is a servant. Everything else is created. So if you talk in terms of creation, it's one creator and everybody else is created. If you talk in terms of divinity, one God, everybody is a servant and everything is a servant. So this is like the most basic concept. Of course, this is something familiar to Muslims and non-Muslims as well. But Tawheed as a concept developed in Islamic theology well beyond what we're talking about. And that's why we ended up with the whole science of Aqidah, creed, which the basic foundation of is Tawheed. And then I'm sure we will kind of get into that discussion more later.
Okay, and moving on from that, the etymology of the word Sufi, where does this word come from?
So scholars have not agreed on where this particular word has come from. There are a number of different ways or opinions as to derive the concept. One popular idea is that it comes from the word suf, wool, because Sufis, or at least some of them, put on those really kind of woolen clothes. Another idea, it came from Safa. Safa means purity. And because Sufis look to purify themselves and get rid of all sins, desires, etc. So that's another derivation. Another popular one is a Sufa. Sufa is in the back of the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a place called Sufa. And that's where immigrant strangers who didn't have anywhere to live would actually stay in that particular place. So it's related to those people who were known for being ascetic in their behaviors and the way they lived. And so Sufa or Sufi is derived from that. And these are some of the kind of ideas from which this particular term is derived, but there are other. The term itself is like other Islamic terms. It doesn't go actually to the time of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. So if you think of the term like Aqidah, well, nobody spoke Aqidah, for instance, in the first century. It developed later. Sufi is the same. Now, this is the term itself as in Sufism, but it's also, if you look at its history, when it was first used, it was used, the earliest mention we know of is a saying attributed to a tabi'i successor called Hassan al-Basri. Hassan al-Basri is one of the Sufis, most Sufis consider him one of their teachers, scholars. And so he is quoted to have said that he met a Sufi circling the Kaaba. So and he was doing pilgrimage there or Umrah. And of course, Al-Hasan al-Basri died 110 Hijri. So we're talking towards the end probably of the first century, beginning of the second century. The term was apparently in circulation. Also, we know of somebody, Jabir bin Hayyan, the father of chemistry, as called. He was called Sufi. And there are somebody, Abu Hashim Sufi. There's another person who died around 150. He was called Sufi. So the term can be traced back, probably, I would say, as far as we can tell, late first century, early second century. I don't think, whether it existed earlier, this is the evidence we have.
Okay. Now, on the back cover, I've already read this. You say that Sufism is often described as the spiritual dimension of Islam. Why does it need a separate designation, a separate concept, if it's just the spiritual? Because the practice of Islam, the practice of praying, for example, is by definition a spiritual, dimension. Why does it need a particular classification as this thing separate from Islam? Almost as if sometimes you have Islam, then you have Sufism, but you're saying actually one is the interior dimension of the other. Sufism is the interior dimension of Islam. So I was wondering where this kind of embodiment of Sufism as a distinct discipline emerged when it's already intrinsic to Islam anyway, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. It is in the same way, the way to relate Sufism to Islam and calling Sufism the spiritual side of Islam, in the same way to think of Sharia as the legal side of Islam, in the same way of looking at tafsir, the interpretation of the Quran. It doesn't introduce something new. It's a term that captures or focuses on certain aspects of Islam, and it is in this context to be understood. So nobody would say, for instance, fiqh is an addition to Islam. Of course, it's not. Now, if you look at the works that scholars wrote on fiqh, of course, they went well beyond what was known to the early generations of Muslims in terms of how it would develop because of the needs of the community of Muslims and the increasing sophistication of the thinking of Muslim scholars, of course. The same applies to Sufism. So Sufism is a term, when you use it, you're not talking about, for instance, the legal obligations. You're really talking about those attributes you would want to focus on in order to purify yourself, in order to become a better Muslim in terms of, and that's very important. In the same way, the law, Islamic law, Sharia, deals with all kinds of behaviors, including our, the way we deal with other people, with the environment, with Muslims, non-Muslims, the way we perform our ibadat. So you're talking transactions, you're talking worshipping, etc. All of that is covered. There are legal rulings, of course, for all of those. In Sufism, when you say Sufism, you're really focused more on yourself as how you kind of introspect, how you self-reflect, how you look inside you. And a Sufi, a proper Sufi, would be in a process of self-examining all the time. You look for your motives. Why did you something? Why did you do something? Why did you not do something? What is it to learn about yourself? How do you get better? Now, that's not something that would occur to you right away by thinking Sharia. You wouldn't think that. Sharia would tell you something else, how to perform certain things, how to do them. Whereas Sufism is to do more with this inner understanding and self-awareness.
Okay. Now, on page 26 of this book, Tawhid according to Sufis, that we're discussing, you list three accusations, really, concerning Sufism. And perhaps we'll go through them one by one. The first one, you state, is misunderstandings concerning the state of fana, or spiritual annihilation. Now, this expression, this term fana, I've come across in various Sufi works, and it was very striking, I must say. And I hadn't come across this idea in the Quran and the Sunnah before, at least. Maybe my ignorance, of course. But perhaps you could explain why there's a misunderstanding concerning this idea of fana, or spiritual annihilation, a key concept in Sufism.
Let me pick first something you said earlier, when you said it doesn't exist in the Quran and Sunnah. The reality is, if we are to restrict ourselves to terminology mentioned in the Quran or Sunnah, we would confine ourselves big time into what we can think and how we to express a variety of ideas, concepts, etc. And there are schools of thought that actually take this approach. Let me give you an example. One term that is used to describe Allah is in Arabic qadim, which means ancient. qidam, ancientness, if you like. And Ibn Hazm al-Zawahiri, the founder of the Zawahiri school of thought, Ibn Hazm al-Zawahiri, he died in the middle of the 5th century. Ibn Hazm al-Zawahiri, for instance, objected to the use of the term qadim, ancient, when referring to Allah. And his argument was, it's not mentioned anywhere in the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, or in the Quran with reference to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's his argument. Of course, but that's not the opinion of the majority. So Ash'ari, Maturidi, even Salafi, most of them would use the term qadim absolutely fine, no problem.
It's actually found in the Bible in Daniel 7, where God is called Ancient of Days.
Absolutely.
Found in the Old Testament, yeah.
Absolutely. So it really, what it's talking about, the reason it was introduced, if you think about it, okay, let me take a little bit step back. The first hadith in Bukhari, you know what the first hadith in Bukhari, Paul, do you remember it?
Yeah, it's actions are judged by intentions, niyat.
Surely Bukhari did not pick it randomly. When he put it there, he was saying, I have compiled the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ. I did my best. That's my intention. Because that hadith is actually ahad, is actually narrated only by Umar. So it's quite strange that you start this compilation of hadith, sahih hadith, with this particular hadith. Very strange. The point I'm trying to make is when we look at anything Islamic scholars do, indeed non-Muslims do, indeed in any walk of life, we have to always look at the intention behind the action, and we just talk. Otherwise, we end up with like Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri. Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, for instance, he was against the use of qiyas, analogy. No analogy, and that's why he's Zahiri. But analogy is part of Islamic jurisprudence. One of the tools we use. So the same applies here. Qadim is actually used to contrast it with muhdath. Muhdath means originated or created. So when they say qadim, what they mean by that, he is the only one who's qadim, who's ancient. Everything else, call him eternal. That kind of meaning. It's intended in that context. It's not like they're adding, let's say, a new beautiful name, a new Asma Allah al-Husna. That's not what they're doing. They're saying this is qadim because everyone else and everything else is muhdath. That's where it comes from. Now, let's go to the word fana.
Yeah.
Fana doesn't exist in the Quran in this sense, in the same way that other terms do not exist. If you look at the term aqidah, it actually appears, as far as I remember, in a verse that talks about affirming oaths. So when you affirm your oath, and that's because aqada means to make firm. So, but it doesn't come in the sense we use it today, to mean creed. When it comes to fana, the issue is the same. We have a term, but we need to look at the meaning of the term.
Right.
What Sufis meant by that. We as human beings, we all know that we all try, Muslims, to live as well as we can, live up to the expectations of Islam, of what is required of us. What we are doing, what we face in trying to achieve that is all kinds of motivations, desires, inclinations, past and baggages that we've carried over the decades or whatever. And you are always in a form of what we call jihad, internal jihad. So you are trying to fight off all these things. And ultimately what you want to get to is what the Quran describes, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْإِنسَ وَالْجِنَّ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created human beings, mankind, and jinns other than to worship me. Well, what does that mean? How do you get to that? So what this ayah is referring to is the conflict that exists between the will of Allah, as in what Allah wants from us, and what we actually In Sufism, at times it's called, even not only in Sufi literature, called the nafs, lower self, let's call it. Things that we are kind of inclined to do at times instinctively, at times, for a variety of reasons. What Sufis mean by annihilation is to get to a point whereby you don't do anything other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants of you. So you wouldn't be motivated by your own desire, by your own interest, etc., all of that. If you get to that point, you're effectively become an instrument, as they would describe it, instrument in the hand of Allah, and Allah would move you as He wishes. If you get to that point, you would have achieved spiritual annihilation. You're no more there, if you like. Now, terminology. Is that a problem? Well, Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the biggest critics of Sufism, in his book, in the Aqidah Tadmuriyah, the creed called Tadmuriyah, he actually mentioned this concept of fana, and in terms of Sufi fana, and he said Sufis talk about, and he divided them into three kinds of fana. And he said the first kind of fana is to achieve fana, annihilation, with respect to all sins, bad actions, etc. And that is good fana. So that is actually good. The second one is what he talked about. He said when you don't see anyone else other than Allah, and you forget everyone else. And he disapproved of that, not strongly, and he said you don't need to do that. It's not reported on the authority of the Prophet. I'm not obviously here critiquing it, but I just want to mention it. And the third one, he meant by that wahdatul wujud, the unity of existence, of and he said that obviously is kufr, etc. So what I'm trying to say, Paul, is that even somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah didn't really object to the term as such, and he allowed and accepted one form of it and didn't have an issue with using that term.
I think that this speaks to the thing about Ibn Taymiyyah. He's sometimes, in my experience, in my humble opinion, misunderstood by some of his followers today, people who say that they follow Ibn Taymiyyah's thought. For example, I sometimes hear people who say they follow him say that all Sufism is bad. Sufism is just haram. Sufism is wrong. And then when I actually read Ibn Taymiyyah, I found that wasn't quite Ibn Taymiyyah's position. He had a nuanced perspective, and some forms, some practices of Sufi thought and practice were acceptable. And he said, as long as they're within the law, as he mentioned, Sharia, they were fine. And he was actually quite praising of some Sufi jurists and theologians. Other kinds of Sufi practice conducted by other kinds of Sufis, he was very, very critical and condemnatory. Absolutely. So he was able to discern and distinguish and be very nuanced. He didn't have a blanket condemnation at all. And you've just illustrated that by this nuanced.
In fact, to confirm, Paul, what you said, obviously in his major work called Al-Fatawa, the Rulings, which is a huge, massive, just testimony to his intelligence, really, and how prolific he was. I think it's 37 volumes or something like that. Volume 10 is called usually about suluk. Suluk is a way of behaving, how you behave, etc. It starts by talking about the states, what you call ahwal wa maqamat, states and stations. These are terms used by Sufis specifically. Quite a lot. And then he goes on, and during all of that volume 10, to talk about a variety of issues, and he touches on Sufism. Volume 11 is about Sufism. All of it is a whole book about Sufism. And that's when you find exactly what you've just described. The criticism of some Sufi practices, Sufi concepts, and the praise of others. And unfortunately, I think what I disagree with some of what he wrote, first of all, what I consider to be really harsh language that he did not need to make these points. That's one. The second, I think there was an element of misunderstanding even on his part. I understand that he's a very clever guy. I'm not saying no. On the other side, he is highly misunderstood, and there's a lot of prejudice against him. Let me give you an example.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mentioned, I published, I don't know, a few months ago, a video on my Arabic channel on Sufism. In that video, what I did, I spoke about what Ibn Taymiyyah thought of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. So I thought, well, this is the Sheikh of Salafis talking about one of the biggest luminaries of Sufism. And he praised him, and he was very, he liked him a lot. In fact, he even wrote a commentary on one of his books, Futuh al-Ghaib, Revelations of the Unseen. And I even spoke about how he related karamas, miracles, if you like, of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani when he was alive, and when the Sheikh was alive, and afterwards. So I tried to kind of show that Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't just, uncompromising. But I get a lot of pushbacks, and some people were really angry, that as if they don't want that negative picture of Ibn Taymiyyah to be tampered with. He has to be positioned as the kind of almost Satan, and we have, because he's against Sufism, against etc. He was a lot more versatile and more diverse and complex than that. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned him, because I think he's not only sometimes misunderstood by some of his followers, but also people who misrepresent him, who perceive themselves to be his enemies, who've not really read Ibn Taymiyyah. He's incredibly subtle and brilliant thinker. Okay, the other issue that you mentioned, the three accusations that people typically make about Sufis contravening Tawhid, is some Sufi writings contain a great deal of metaphorical and special language. And for example, Ibn Arabi. And on a slightly different note, I remember when I first started reading Rumi, who is one of the most famous Sufi writers of all time, and his use of language to do with, say, alcohol to express spiritual states. Alcohol obviously is haram in Islam, and that struck me as a slightly odd thing, odd meta. But I mean, I guess he's a poet. He's using language in curious, interesting ways. But again, it can sound a bit off if the language of being inebriated by alcohol is used, which is a haram thing, in spiritual discourse. It kind of seems a bit odd. But that's not to do with Tawhid, though, directly anyway. So what is you mentioned Sufi writers containing a great deal of metaphorical language. How is this a source of misunderstanding, particularly in reference to Ibn Arabi himself?
So, Ibn Arabi, we Muslims, a lot of us obviously read a lot of books in a variety of different subjects. Not all books are as accessible. Not all books are easy to understand. This is a simple fact. Everybody would agree with that. It's when we get to the specifics that people start differing. Let me tell you something about Ibn Arabi. I've been a Sufi from the late 1980s. And I've written a lot about Sufism. And you may be surprised, Paul, if I told you that I haven't read a single book by Ibn Arabi. Not a single book. I have read certain kind of really small letter, let's call it, because of certain interest I had in it. And I also looked for quotes for this book from his writings, and I didn't want to take much, just something short to include him on the book, because he's a major name, and particularly on the subject that cannot be ignored. Now, the reason, if you ask me, why did I not read him, or why don't I read him? First of all, I know his writings, what his writings are about. It's not that I'm familiar with them. The subjects he writes about are not for me. I don't need them. I don't deal with those. Some of what he writes is complex, is open to interpretation, etc. I'm aware of that. I know all of that. But I don't need, and I'm not, listen, I'm not the most intelligent person, but I'm not an idiot either. So it's not like I can't read them and I can pick a book in Arabic or English about Ibn Arabi, by Ibn Arabi, and read about it. But I know some of what he wrote is very complex. Some of what those authors wrote, they did not write whatever they wrote necessarily the way you write a book on fiqh, the way you write a book on aqidah, for instance. When you write fiqh and when you write aqidah, you are reasoning. You are reasoning. What I mean by that, your main tool of production of the product is your reason. So you're thinking all the time. When you write something like poetry, let's say, for example, that's not what you're doing. You're actually writing mainly driven by certain feelings you have, as well as using the language in the loose way, as you mentioned about Rumi. And when you write Sufi works, depending on the subject of what you're writing about, it could be very complex because it could be a matter of something you're feeling, and there's an element of what you're feeling kind of trying to express. If you saw, let's just think about it this way. If you had a spiritual experience, a really strange one, paranormal one, and your language failed to totally capture what you saw, what you heard, what you experienced, yet for whatever reason, you felt you needed to write it down, for whatever reason, and you wrote it, there is every possibility that somebody like me coming to that book, reading that book, wouldn't actually get exactly what you meant to say, and it's very possible that I may understand it. If you want to describe for me the spirit world, alam al-ruh, and if you're somebody who is closer to angels, let's say for instance, and you want to write about that, it is very possible that you may say things I won't even be able to understand. So the language used there can be metaphorical, can use a lot of kind of symbolic language, and some of it just talks about things I actually don't believe myself will be able to fully understand.
I get what you're saying, but when people like Ibn Arabi use language in English, unity of being, Jude, so when he teaches that only God truly exists, and all other existence is like contingent or derivative, it does sound like to some people a kind of a pantheism or panentheism, which is very
okay. I accept that. Yes.
And the language itself can arguably be ambiguous. You know, I take your point about, poetic language or metaphorical language has that property, but it seems to intrinsically invite some people's minds that criticism. It is tending in a pantheistic direction. Now, a lot of his defenders deny this, of course, and say he's been misunderstood. But I kind of wondering if he could have used clearer language to avoid these ambiguities and these criticisms.
It's possible, but there's a third point we'll get to later, which is basically, if you want to understand anyone's writings, then obviously a Muslim writer, we can't exclude their writings from their life and how they lived, what they did, etc. Nor we can take, nor can we take kind of part of the writing and ignore another part.
But this is the third point about taking words of a Sufi out of context.
Absolutely.
So this is a fair point. Of course, one must understand the intended meaning of expressions or terms as the author meant, rather than just attributing our own random interpretation.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a principle in Quranic exegesis called Al-Quran yufassiruhu ba'dahu ba'da, yufassiru ba'dahu ba'da, meaning the Quran interprets itself. So when we look at, and that's the principle I use, it was first mentioned, as far as I can trace it back, to a mention in Nahj al-Balagha by Imam Ali bin Abi Talib. It was mentioned by Zamakhshari, I think, in his tafsir. But in fact, Ibn Taymiyyah is the one who kind of articulated it as clearly as I put it here. Now, if you look at the Quran, if you ignore some parts of it, the theology can look very different. And what you can get of the image of what the Quran is trying to teach becomes extremely distorted, because there are certain kind of explanations you find them in another parts of the Quran, even though you're reading about them here, but the full picture cannot be seen until you put it together. This is the Quran. This is the Kitab of Allah that is described as mubin, as in clear, manifest. Well, if the word of Allah, which is mubin, cannot be fully understood unless it's taken it's in wholeness, in totality, together, well, how can we then pick on one of his creatures, one of his created beings, a human being, and look at some of his writings and say, well, I'm picking those writings and I'm not actually looking at the rest. And on top of that, we ignore what that person lived like. Let me give you an example. How could somebody like, whether Ibn Arabi or someone else, get away with it wherever he lived, with whoever people he met, by actually telling them, introducing concepts as weird and as close to what most people would call kufr, disbelief? How would he get away with that? What does it mean for Ibn Arabi, as I mentioned in the book, to sit and say, La ilaha illallah? What does it mean to call himself servant? You see, Paul, just to expand a little bit on that, there's a concept in the Quran, and that actually will kind of connect to what I mentioned earlier, called al-ma'iyya. Al-ma'iyya. Ma'iyya, it's derived from the word ma'a, with. So in the Quran, there are two kinds of ma'iyya, as a state of being with. Allah being with. One of them, they called al-ma'iyya al-amma, general state of ma'iyya, general state of being with, Allah being with us. So, and that would be when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ, and He is with you wherever you are, wherever you be. That's called al-ma'iyya al-amma, meaning He's with us wherever we go, whatever we do. But there's also another concept of ma'iyya, being with, which is, they're called ma'iyya al-khassa, special. That applies, inna Allaha ma'al mu'mineen, Allah is with the believers. That is a different kind of ma'iyya than when He says, وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. When He says, and He's with you wherever you are, He's talking to everybody. Everybody, kafir, Muslim, etc., everybody. But when He says, and when He said, for instance, to Sayyidina Musa, إِنَّنِي مَعَكُمْ أَسْمَعُ وَأَرَى, I am with you, hearing and seeing, He's talking special kind of being with, ma'iyya. Now, if somebody looked at only one of some of these verses, but not the other verse, they would miss one of the two meanings of ma'iyya, and they wouldn't have the full picture. If you look at, for instance, the quote that I have from Ibn Arabi in the book, and if you look at it and look at some of what he says there, and you ask yourself, how on earth can someone who writes something like this be accused of something like unity of existence, wahdat al-wujud, or to think that God is on him or he isn't part of God? It just doesn't make sense, because his words are completely clear. Now, we have two options, either to say, well, he changed over time, but there's nobody who says that, or to say that, well, these are not his real words. That's also quite a bit of a rich assumption, difficult to, and we can't. Yeah.
No, I hear what you're saying, but there are examples of Sufi thinkers you quote in the book. One is Al-Hallaj.
Yeah,
and he's best known for his utterance, "Ana al-Haq," I am the truth, and this was seen by many as blasphemous, since al-Haq is one of the names of God in Islam, and this is where perhaps the legal side, you mentioned fiqh early on, and the inner dimension of Islam, that they come into contact, because if one goes around publicly saying I am the truth, that contravenes the divine law, of course, because only God can say that. And he was actually executed, and apparently in quite a gruesome way. What exactly for is debated, apparently, but and this could be perhaps the most extreme example of the dangers of Sufism, when what could be interpreted by his supporters as a kind of a mystical union with God, fana, annihilation of the self, but the problem is, Islamically and publicly, jurists viewed it as heretical. And it might be one thing to say this in the privacy of your own home, but to go around in public saying this is not innocent, is it? Because to the public it sounds very much like one is claiming to be God, in a way, obviously, which is completely unacceptable. So this is slightly different. This is not like an academic scholarly exposition of the union, and this is a provocative public statement, arguably meant to provoke a reaction, although I don't know, is this not going too far, is what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, okay, so the assessment of al-Hallaj by Sufis, even those, there are some who disapprove of him altogether, and in his book, Abdurrahman as-Sulami said that some mashayikh don't even consider him as a Sufi. Some mashayikh. It wasn't clear whether he's talking about Sufi mashayikh or scholars in general. But then he included him in his own book of Sufi. So clearly he approved of him. I actually like what Abdul Qadir Jilani said about him. And he said that Al-Hallaj tripped, and there was no one in his time to give him a hand. If I were there, I would have helped him. What I think the use of athara.
Well, so what do you mean? Sorry, what did he mean by help him? You mean like, call him to one side and say, look, mate, what you're doing is just
exactly.
It's going to be misunderstood. It's going to sound completely heretical. Indeed, it is heretical. It contravenes divine law, the Sharia. You can't say that. It is contrary.
Correct.
Law. And so, okay, I can see
that. So, but what's interesting to me, in particular, this coming from Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, and his status is really not subject to controversy among Sufis and non-Sufis, is that he didn't say he committed kufr, disbelief. He said he's tripped. He used effectively the wrong language. The way he spoke, misspoke, etc., call it whatever. Why he did what he did, difficult to tell. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali has actually a quote on this. Is it okay if I try to read it, actually?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I think it might give us...
the book?
Yes. Yeah. It's. I'll tell you something where you find it, actually, Paul. It is in...
What, the Hallaj?
Yeah, it's, I think, 27, page 27.
Oh, I see. Okay. What, the Al-Ghazali?
Yeah, the quote there, I think, is worth reading, probably, Paul. It's...
Okay, Al-Ghazali went on to add that the misunderstanding has resulted from treating metaphorical Sufi statements as if they were literal. Some Sufi speech is almost poetic prose, and the language of poetry is often metaphorical. This is you writing this, I presume. Yeah. And then you quote Al-Ghazali: the words of the lovers when they are in a state of intoxication should be concealed, not spoken out. When their intoxication has subsided and they have returned under the control of the intellect, which is Allah's scale on his earth, they realize that this was not true unification, but something similar to unification. It is like a lover saying under the influence of extreme love, I am he whom I love, and he whom I love is I. Okay, well then, I get what's been said there, but then this language should be spoken of, it should be concealed, not spoken.
Yeah.
But you don't say it publicly. Why? Because obviously anyone else is not participating in this intoxication in this context, and are just seeing the words, hearing the words, and just hearing blasphemy. They're not. They can't understand the context because they're not participating in this love.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the kind of the main idea here is that, and that's very important, actually, understanding it in the context of discussion, and kind of trying to work out what Sufism is about. The Sufis lived what you might call spiritual experiences, whether it could be in all kinds of forms. Some of these are personal experiences, experiences very, very personal. They are not common experiences. So, for instance, they're not to be shared. When we, for instance, study law, Sharia, or when we study tafsir, or aqidah, etc. This is an activity that can be done collectively, together, individually. We come together and talk about it. And the analysis is never personal. It may have ijtihad, it may have some insight, but actually the subject matter, the domain, is public domain. What we're talking about is something very, very different. So when, for instance, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani says about Futuh al-Ghaib, one of his books, the Revelations of the Insi, when he says, I'm writing here some of what has become revealed to me, let's say. The term is slightly not revealed in the terms of the way the Quran revealed, but what kind of openings, revelations occur to me. And then he would go on and write a whole book. That book, by its nature, was public. But he said in the beginning that some of what I could write effectively, others, for whatever reason, he couldn't. So Sufis have spiritual experiences. I think when you think of Islam as simply just look at the outward of the human being, and you look at the way they behave, etc., the way they pray. We all pray together. We all, fast in the same way, go to Hajj in the same way. But people, individuals, can have very different personal experiences, and these experiences can be extremely powerful, extremely powerful. Now, these are often private and to be kept private. So in Sufism, for instance, if a karama happens to you, if you experience a supernatural miracle, you must not disclose it. You must not go out public and say, oh, by the way, so-and-so happened to me. This is a personal experience. And the reason, because it can affect you yourself, because you would be seeking, people some kind of praise, you're seeking some status with people, etc. And
many Christians are very keen on doing that, is publicly disclosing supernatural events, alleged supernatural events in their lives. And the problems with this, because it can lead to pride. It can also lead to fabrication of events, that some of these experiences are known to be forged or not true, and also can lead to embellishment and exaggeration.
Yes.
Because one wants to impress, and then
absolutely
it didn't happen. It happened, but do you know, it was even more like this, and you get details added and so on. And this is always a danger. So the advice to keep it private has a certain wisdom to it, I think.
Sufism is ultimately is to work against your kibr, pride, is to try and efface yourself, if you like. And that's what leads ultimately to what we call fana. Now, I remember one of my Sheikh Muhammad al-Kasnazan, the Sheikh I mentioned earlier, he passed away in 2020. He used to say about karama or miracle, he used to say, the seeker, the Sufi, who experiences a karama should treat it in the same way an old, powerless woman would hide, a poor woman would hide a coin in her hand, because she's powerless, anybody can steal it from it, and you hide it this way. The way she hides that coin is exactly how you should hide any karama that occurs to you. And obviously what he's talking as well here is that whatever you're going to see it's going to be no more than this little coin relative to the wealth that exists out there. So he's telling also the seeker, if something like that happens to you, when it happens to you, don't be particularly impressed. What you've been given, what you've been seen, is absolutely very little, almost negligible, let alone you go out, publicize it, and then that comes back to bite you.
And this explains something that has often confused people, because often on YouTube, to get very contemporary and social media for a second, often on YouTube, you will, like in America, you'll get stories of the miraculous recounted by Christians usually, in a way that's very kind of, not exhibitionist, but they really want to show forth what's happened to them in great detail, and they kind of glory in it. And you wonder why that there is a comparative dearth or relative absence of stories from Muslims, from Sufis, particularly perhaps Sufi Muslims. And this may go some way to explaining the cultural and religious differences between Islam and Christianity. What one is, it doesn't have a problem with these kind of displays of the miraculous to entice and amuse and evangelize, and another actually keeps it private because for the reasons you've mentioned. And I think this goes some way to explaining the relative dearth of social stories about this. Although, when people become Muslims, they will rightly testify a sense of peace and forgiveness and mercy and compassion and so on, and how that changes lives. But I'm talking about the supernatural here.
Yes, I think, Paul, one thing that if you, a Sufi, or if you live a Sufi life, and if you be in the company of somebody who really lives a Sufi life, you are likely to experience what let's call them Islamic spiritual experiences. But they become part of you and part of your experience, personal experience of Islam. As a Muslim, I share all kinds of intellectual work through your channel, through other. These are things that what we do. There's nothing personal about them. I mean, even ijtihad here, insight, whatever. It's part of things you can share. But as a Muslim, in the same way you have private matter, personal things you don't want to share with everybody. These are private. The same applies to your spiritual life. You have a spiritual life. Sufism is about that. We were talking about spiritual side of Islam. Sufism can inject into your life some richness that otherwise might not be there. Now, we are not talking here specifically about miracles and karama, but I'll mention something in relation to what you mentioned earlier about Christians basically publicizing and broadcasting all kinds of things. In Islamic sciences, we have two terms. We have karama, which is what we've been using. Karama means a miracle that's given to a person, a wali they call him, or a person who's a righteous person, whether to affirm his faith, to strengthen his faith, her faith, or as just honor to him, something for himself. They're called karama, and they differentiate it from mu'jiza. Mu'jiza means miracle of a prophet. So they have different term. Karama, mu'jiza. But they have another term called mahana. Mahana. Mahana is the exact of karama. If karama is something that gives somebody honor, mahana is to dishonor somebody. And what they mean by mahana is supernatural events that happen to people who do not follow Sharia, who are not proper Muslims, yet they can still actually, through certain means. For instance, we in Islam believe in devils, believe in magic, believe in all kinds of things that can happen in the spirit world. So somebody can actually develop on the face of it what looks like very supernatural powers. They call it mahana, like something that a dishonor, as the exact opposite of karama, which is something that honors the person who has it. Okay. So for us in Islam, there's no separation between a supernatural feat and how you live your life as a Muslim. It cannot be and it doesn't mean much if you are not following the law, for instance, you're not following Sharia.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And that final comment, it was actually my point as well in conclusion, in a way, is that if I've understood Ibn Taymiyyah correctly, that there's nothing wrong with Sufi practices as long as they are within the divine law. They don't transgress the law, like going out in public and saying, I am the truth, for example, is which is going to break the law. The Islamic law, the law of God, this is not man-made thing. This is transgressive. But if it doesn't transgress, then it's perfectly fine. And if the emphasis is on self-purification, inner renewal, the intention, as you say, the heart, the inner dimension, the spiritual dimension of Islam, then that's perfectly acceptable. And there's something I've noticed is that there seems to be a spectrum of Sufisms. It's not like a single entity. It's an expression of multiple people over many, many centuries, going back to the early times. And some of it is self-purificatory in intent, and others involve arguably transgressive practices at graveyards and so on, which have caused a lot of censure. So one has to be very discriminating and discerning about what one means when one talks about this subject, and have a great deal of knowledge about it, so that one's not really just straw manning something and just
I think
of it, which is what sometimes happens.
I agree with you. I think in terms of visiting graveyards, I don't think there's any problem with that, and I can get into it, but it's slightly different subject here about certain practices. We don't want, but what I would say, I'll give one example from Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned, I mentioned earlier that he quoted certain karamas of Sheikh Abdul Qadir, and he mentioned one of them whereby quoting Abdul Qadir Jilani, and he said one day he was praying when he saw a huge throne and light coming with that throne, and he heard a voice telling him, Abdul Qadir, we have kind of abolished all requirements for you to worship, presumably because he's become so close to Allah. And he said, and the voice said, I am God, something along these lines, and we have done. And he said that, idhab ya mal'oon, go away, you cursed one. These obligations were not abolished for those who became before me of the prophets. They would not be abolished for myself. And Ibn Taymiyyah actually quotes this particular incident about Sheikh Abdul Qadir, and he says, well, as in the context of showing the importance of Sharia, and also talking about those Sufis that he approved of. So yes, I mean, the connection between these two, and you can see how, because the reply, we're told in the same narrative, of Satan is to tell him that I have already deluded 70 people with this. I couldn't delude you. That's the reply of, and whom Satan would have targeted. That he wouldn't have targeted somebody who's sitting in a bar. He would have targeted people who were worshippers close to him, which is why in Sufism also they always kind of, you're always reminded how you have to be on your toes.
Yes,
and not
vigilant, and rather
absolutely,
being intoxicated by experiences and losing common sense and vigilance. Gosh, well, perhaps we might draw it to a close. There's much more that you could say, or we could say. Of course, this is a massive.
I would like just to mention one thing, if you don't mind, Paul, here quickly. The Sufism is always kind of presented as a source of controversy for obvious reasons. We discussed some of them here, but I would like to just introduce a concept here and leave it for viewers to think about it.
Right.
If we read the history of Islam and Islamic sciences, yes, there are Sufis who kind of went in the wrong direction, spoke and said the wrong thing, like in any, frankly, school of thought, philosophy, etc. But I would like to say that the thing that really hurt us as Muslims isn't actually Sufism as much. Nothing kind of affected Muslims and their unity as Aqidah. And I mean by Aqidah, what you asked me earlier, what is Tawhid? And I mentioned a most basic definition. In Islam, we have a concept called pillars of faith, Arkan al-Iman, or Usul al-Iman. And these are to believe in Allah, His books, His prophets, angels, the last day, and the predestination. 6 of them. They are mentioned in the Quran, and there's also a famous hadith, they're known as Hadith Jibril. So famous known. Now, this is the most basic thing. And I mentioned this very quickly, actually, in the book, because it's such an important thing. If we look at ourselves, Muslims, and why we have ended up just in really extremely divided and split, because this basic concept of faith developed over time, and we developed those huge concepts, complex concept of the attributes of God, the names, they're called asma and sifat, attributes and names. The question of, was the Quran created, or was it old, ancient with Allah? And then what you ended up with, those distinct schools of Aqidah, and suddenly your Aqidah is no more actually what the original first generation of Muslims were taught, learned, which is the commonality, these common kind of arkan al-iman, the pillars of faith, the basic pillars of faith. And then we ended up into groups that often accuse each other of kufr, of all kinds. And when you look at something, those books and the details of them, most people, most Muslims, can't even understand half of them. I mean, the Quran was revealed to the Bedouin in Arabia. He was revealed to those people who had very little education, didn't read and write, and he is the book that's going to be relevant and for everybody to the day of judgment, to the end of time. So to the most sophisticated and to the most kind of basic and simple of people. But Aqidah has split it apart, has turned it into really quite... The other day, somebody got in touch with me and he said, oh, I would like to buy your book on this new book on Tawhid, but I would like to know first which school of fiqh you follow and which Aqidah you follow. And I looked at them, well, Aqidah, what does Aqidah mean? If you put listen, Mu'tazili, most people would say Mu'tazilis are the punching bag of Muslims now. But if you look at a book like Sharh al-Usul al-Khamsa, the explanation of the 5 principles of Mu'tazila by Qadi Abdul Jabbar, is one of the luminaries of Mu'tazilite. It's a huge book, very detailed book. When you read it, you may disagree with a lot of what he says, but the approach that we should avoid is to look at it and say, well, he's kafir, or he's done this or that, or because if I caricature, the approach that a lot of time you find in between kind of Muslim scholars taking when they critique each other is, you idiot, you kafir. So basically even accusing them of idiocy or disbelief. And that is something that is built and has become very intrinsic part of Aqidah. And yes, Sufism, and by the way, you don't find this in interpretation of the Quran. So people tolerant of that. So you have different exegetes and you have no issue. What about schools of fiqh? Absolutely fine. Ijtihad there is absolutely fine. No problem there. Yet, what really split us apart and turned us into communities within one big nation is how Aqidah has developed into this monstrous kind of concepts that most basic Muslims, most Muslims aren't even able to understand. And Sufism is not a Aqidah, by the way. Sufism is just a way to behave. So, but most Sufis are usually considered as Ahl Sunnah, what's traditionally called Ahl Sunnah with Jama'ah.
They must, indeed. So, thank you for that. So, this is the book Inclusion Tawhid among according to Sufis, the oneness of God in Sufism, published by Sufis Publishing. I'll link to it in the description below if you want to sample many of the leading Sufi writers and thinkers across the many centuries, quoted at length on Tawhid, really. And obviously we've only touched very briefly on one or two of those writers. So There you are. That's the book, Tawhid According to Sufis. Thank you so much, Dr. Louay Fatoohi, for your time. You're incredibly active intellectually in producing so many works and books and videos and articles and so on. It's extraordinary. One-man industry, really. So,
well, I can't do 10% of what you do. Let's be honest.
No, you do 110%. I agree.
Not really, no.
Anyway, enough about that. All right, well, thank you very much. Until next time, thank you so much for your time. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you for clarifying some misconceptions about Sufism. Whatever our thoughts are, I think we need to listen and understand before we pass judgment on anything. So thank you very much for your time. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.